There's a moment before every collapse when everything still looks normal. The lights are on, markets are open, politicians are confident. And yet, underneath, the system has already crossed a line it can't uncross. History shows this moment comes long before panic, long before headlines, long before anyone admits what's happening. Because empires don't fall randomly, they fall in sequence. In the last century alone, entire nations didn't just decline, they followed a precise, repeatable path. Greece, Argentina, Lebanon. Each one believed its crisis was unique. Each one told its people the same story. This is temporary. This is manageable. This is different. And each one reached the same final stage anyway. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Debt collapse isn't chaotic. It's mechanical. It moves step by step, like a countdown. And once you recognize the stages, you can tell exactly where a country is headed long before the crash arrives. That's why this matters. Because the United States isn't guessing its future. It's retracing one that's already been written. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, stage by stage. Right now in 2025, America is not at the beginning of the process. And it's not at the end either. It's deep enough that reversal is no longer easy, but early enough that most people still feel safe. That is the most dangerous point in the entire cycle. Every nation that died at stage 9 once stood exactly here. Greece didn't wake up one morning bankrupt. Argentina didn't collapse overnight. Lebanon didn't implode because of a single bad decision. They crossed invisible thresholds years earlier. Debt piled up quietly. Confidence eroded slowly. And by the time the public understood what was happening, the final stages were already locked in. This is where the illusion lives. As long as things appear stable, people assume stability exists. But debt systems don't collapse when people panic. They collapse when the math stops working. And the math always stops working before the headlines change. In this video, we were going to walk through the 9-stage debt implosion pattern that has destroyed modern economies again and again. Not theory, not opinion. A documented sequence that repeats with disturbing consistency. More importantly, we're going to place the United States inside that sequence. Precisely, honestly. Without comfort narratives. Because when you understand which stage you're in, you also understand what comes next. And what comes next is never gradual. But before we name the stages, you need to understand why nations never recognize them in time. Why warning signs feel harmless. Why leaders deny reality. And why populations always believe collapse happens to others. That blindness is the first real signal. And it's exactly where this story begins. Every debt collapse begins with something that looks harmless. Even responsible. Governments call it stimulus, stability, protection. In reality, it's the first step onto a path that narrows with every move forward. Stage 1 is not crisis, it's expansion. This is the phase where a country learns it can borrow without immediate pain. Growth looks strong, living standards rise, public spending feels justified. Debt increases, but it's framed as investment. And because nothing breaks right away, confidence hardens into belief. This is where leaders make the most consequential mistake of the entire sequence. They assume access to debt is permanent. At stage 1, interest rates are manageable, creditors are eager, the country's reputation is strong, bonds are trusted. The currency still carries weight. Borrowing feels like leverage, not risk. Greece experienced this after joining the euro. Argentina felt it when global lenders reopened credit lines. Lebanon lived it when foreign capital flooded its banking system. Each one believed they had unlocked a new economic tier. Each one believed the rules had changed. They hadn't. Stage 1 always expands promises faster than productivity. Governments commit to programs, pensions, subsidies, guarantees. None of it feels reckless because revenues are still coming in, the economy still functions, jobs still exist, consumption still grows. But here's the problem no one wants to see yet. Debt grows exponentially. Productive output does not. At this stage, debt doesn't crush the system. It reshapes behavior. Politicians learn that borrowing is easier than reform. Voters learn they can demand more without paying more. Institutions learn that risk can be postponed, and postponement becomes policy. The danger of stage 1 isn't the debt itself, it's the habit it creates. A habit of delay, a habit of denial, a habit of assuming tomorrow will always cover today. By the time Greece entered stage 2, its political system had already been trained to rely on borrowing. Argentina's institutions were already addicted to rollover financing. Lebanon's economy was already structured around inflows, not production. Stage 1 sets the trap. Everything after it tightens the walls. And here's the part most people miss. The United States passed stage 1 years ago, massive deficits during growth, debt normalized in peacetime, spending justified by confidence rather than capacity. At the time, it felt manageable, necessary even. That's exactly how stage 1 is supposed to feel. Because if it felt dangerous, no country would ever advance to stage 2, but they always do. And once they do, the options narrow fast. In the next stage, debt stops being a choice and starts becoming a requirement. And that's where the illusion of control quietly disappears. Stage 2 is the moment a debt changes character. What once felt like flexibility becomes dependency. The system can no longer function without constant inflows of new borrowing, and any interruption suddenly feels existential. This is where the warnings begin, but they're easy to ignore. At stage 2, growth slows, not collapses, just enough to matter. Revenues underperform projections, expenses remain locked in, promises made during stage 1 can't be reversed without backlash. So governments do the only thing that preserves calm in the short term. They borrow more. This is the phase where refinancing replaces repayment. Old debt isn't paid down. It's rolled forward. New bonds are issued to service existing obligations. Interest costs rise, but they're still framed as manageable. Greece lived here for years before anyone panicked. Argentina cycled through this phase repeatedly. Lebanon depended on it entirely. As long as capital kept flowing, the system appeared stable. But stability at stage 2 is deceptive. It depends on confidence, not fundamentals. At this point, lenders start paying attention to trajectories instead of snapshots. They don't ask whether the country can pay today. They ask whether it can pay 10 years from now. And the answer begins to blur. So the terms change. Interest rates creep higher. Maturities shorten. Conditions appear. Nothing breaks yet, but pressure builds quietly. Governments respond predictably. They reassure. They publish optimistic forecasts. They promise growth, reforms, future revenues. And for a while, that's enough. But something subtle shifts here. Policy stops being proactive. It becomes reactive. Decisions are no longer about building capacity. They're about keeping the system functioning another year. This is also when currency credibility starts to matter more than ever. If the currency is trusted, the country can delay consequences. If it isn't, stage 2 accelerates violently. Lebanon's banking system relied entirely on confidence. When doubts surfaced, the system froze. Argentina's currency lost trust early, forcing repeated resets. Greece lost monetary control entirely, locking it into austerity. The United States occupies a unique position here. Its currency is still trusted. That trust has delayed consequences longer than in any prior example, but it hasn't removed them. At stage 2, debt becomes structural. You can't cut it without breaking something. You can't grow fast enough to outrun it. You can only refinance and hope conditions remain favorable. This is the moment when exit paths begin to close. Not visibly, quietly, legally, financially. And once a country reaches the next stage, debt stops being a financial issue at all. It becomes a political one. And that's when stability starts to fracture. Stage 3 is where governments stop pretending debt can be solved with borrowing alone. This is the point where the currency quietly becomes the tool of adjustment. No announcement is made. No emergency is declared. The shift happens through policy language that sounds technical, boring, and harmless. Liquidity support, monetary flexibility, temporary measures. But the effect is always the same. At this stage, printing replaces borrowing as the primary stabilizer, not because leaders want inflation, but because the alternatives are worse. Raise taxes and the economy contracts. Cut spending and social unrest rises. Default and the system collapses immediately. So the currency absorbs the pressure. Greece didn't control its currency, which is why stage 3 was brutal and visible. Argentina and Lebanon did, which is why their pain was delayed and disguised. Prices rose slowly at first. Savings eroded quietly. Wages lagged. Official inflation numbers understated reality. That's how stage 3 works. It transfers the cost from the state to the population without ever admitting it's happening. Confidence starts to fracture here, but unevenly. Wealthy insiders protect themselves. Assets inflate. Real estate rises. Stocks decouple from the real economy. Meanwhile, everyday purchasing power slips month by month. Most people don't call it collapse, they call it adjustment. But something crucial breaks during stage 3. The currency stops being a store of value. It still functions as money. You can spend it, you can earn it, but you can no longer trust it. Once that trust erodes, behavior changes. People spend faster, they save less, capital seeks exits, long-term planning collapses into short-term survival. Argentina saw this in waves. Lebanon saw it almost overnight. Greece experienced it through forced austerity. Different mechanisms, same outcome. For the United States, this stage has been normalized. Trillions created with the promise they're temporary. Inflation framed as transitory. Purchasing power loss treated as unavoidable. And because the dollar still holds global trust, the consequences feel muted, for now. But stage 3 doesn't resolve debt, it masks it. And the longer it runs, the more severe the next adjustment becomes. This is the stage where policymakers believe they've bought time. In reality, they've borrowed it from the future at compounding cost. Because once the currency weakens enough, external confidence starts to matter more than internal narratives. And that's when the next stage arrives without warning. Stage 4 is not about numbers anymore, it's about behavior. This is the point where confidence quietly exits, long before headlines admit there's a problem. Capital becomes cautious. Investors shorten timelines. Institutions stop asking how much they can earn and start asking how fast they can exit. Nothing collapses publicly yet, but everything becomes fragile. In Greece, stage 4 showed up as capital flight years before default. In Argentina, it appeared as repeated currency controls. In Lebanon, it was bank restrictions disguised as temporary measures. Each time, authorities insisted stability would return once conditions normalized. Conditions never normalized. At stage 4, governments begin interfering with markets to slow the damage. Controls are introduced not to fix problems, but to hide them. Withdrawal limits, trade restrictions, emergency regulations, all framed as short-term safeguards. The moment these appear, the system has already lost trust, because confidence is asymmetric. It takes years to build and days to destroy. Once people believe rules might change, they act before those rules are imposed. And that behavior accelerates the very crisis leaders are trying to prevent. This is where debt stops being abstract. Businesses can't plan. Banks stop lending. Investment freezes. Economic activity slows, not because resources disappeared, but because trust did. The United States is approaching this stage differently, but the mechanics are familiar. Capital hasn't fled yet. Instead, it's hedging. Diversifying, seeking alternatives. That's always the precursor. When foreign holders begin questioning long-term exposure, the reserve status, that once absorbed pressure, starts to weaken. And when that happens, stage 5 arrives quickly. Stage 4 is the last phase where collapse can still be mistaken for volatility. But once confidence breaks, no amount of reassurance can restore it. Because the system doesn't need panic to fail, it only needs doubt. And doubt, once introduced, never leaves quietly. Stage 5 is where denial becomes policy. By this point, leaders know the system is unstable. They may not admit it publicly, but every action reveals it. The goal is no longer growth, it's control, holding things together, buying time. This is when governments start protecting the structure at the expense of the population. Taxes rise, but not enough to fix the problem. Spending cuts appear, but not where the debt actually is. Instead, the burden shifts downward. Inflation becomes permanent. Wages lag, benefits erode, savings vanish slowly enough that outrage stays fragmented. In Greece, this stage looked like endless austerity. In Argentina, it came as repeated currency resets. In Lebanon, it arrived as outright confiscation through frozen deposits. Different expressions, same outcome. The state survives by extracting value from its own citizens. At stage 5, inequality accelerates. Those closest to power exit early or insulate themselves. Everyone else absorbs the loss. Social cohesion fractures. Trust in institutions collapses. People stop believing rules are fair or even real. This is also where political dysfunction explodes. Elections become volatile. Protests increase. Extremes gain power. Compromise disappears because there's nothing left to divide. The United States is visibly entering this phase. Cost of living rises faster than incomes. Public faith in institutions is near historic lows. Politics becomes tribal because the system no longer delivers stability. And once a society turns inward like this, external confidence notices, because a country that cannot govern itself credibly cannot be trusted financially forever. Stage 5 doesn't end with reform. It ends when the system can no longer extract enough to sustain itself. That's when the final stages stop being gradual. And once the next threshold is crossed, there is no policy left that can slow what follows. Stage 6 is the turning point, not because something explodes, but because something quietly changes direction. This is when the outside world begins preparing for a future without you. Reserve currency status isn't lost with an announcement. It erodes through behavior. Trade deals quietly shift settlement terms. Central banks rebalance reserves. Long-term contracts introduce alternatives. None of it looks dramatic on its own, but together it changes everything. This is what happened to Greece when capital markets stopped treating its bonds as risk-free. It's what Argentina faced when foreign lenders demanded dollar repayment instead of pesos. It's what Lebanon experienced when deposits were no longer trusted as real money. Stage 6 is when confidence doesn't just weaken, it leaves. For a reserve currency country, this stage is uniquely dangerous because the privilege that once absorbed excess spending suddenly reverses. Dollars that once stayed abroad begin coming home. Demand falls, supply surges, inflation pressure intensifies, and policymakers misread it every time. They think the problem is speculation or geopolitics or temporary instability, so they respond with diplomacy, messaging, coordination. But stage 6 isn't about narratives. It's about alternatives becoming viable. When the world no longer needs to hold your currency, your ability to export inflation disappears, and the adjustment you postponed for decades arrives all at once. This is where Greece lost control. This is where Argentina lost credibility. This is where Lebanon lost its financial system entirely. The United States is not immune to this stage. It has only delayed it longer than anyone else. Once stage 6 fully sets in, debt markets reprice instantly. Interest costs spike. Deficits accelerate. Emergency measures become permanent. And at that point, there's only one stage left, the one no country ever believes it will reach. Stage 7 is what everyone imagines collapse looks like. Markets breaking, banks freezing, emergency announcements. But that's not the end of the sequence. It's the beginning of the end. Stage 8 is normalization of emergency. What was once unthinkable becomes routine. Controls stay in place. Temporary programs become permanent. The public adjusts downward. People stop asking when things will return to normal and start asking how to survive within the new limits. This is where Argentina lived for decades. This is where Greece still exists. This is where Lebanon remains trapped. The system doesn't fully die yet. It just stops functioning as a modern economy. And then comes stage 9. Stage 9 is not chaos. It's erasure. The old system doesn't collapse in flames. It becomes irrelevant. Contracts are rewritten. Savings are wiped out through restructuring or inflation. Debts are reset in ways that favor institutions over individuals. The promises that defined the previous era simply stop being honored. At stage 9, the country still exists. The flag still flies. Elections may still happen. But the financial identity that once mattered is gone. Greece lost a generation. Argentina lost trust permanently. Lebanon lost its middle class almost overnight. Different paths, same destination. And this is why the earlier stages matter so much, because by the time stage 9 arrives, there are no decisions left to make, only consequences left to absorb. The United States is not at stage 9 today, but it is past the point where stage 9 can be dismissed as impossible. It is deep enough into the sequence that timing, not probability, is the only remaining variable. Every nation that reached stage 7 believed reform was still possible. Some tried. None escaped the final reset without immense loss. This is not a prediction, it's a pattern. And patterns don't care about intentions, ideologies, or optimism. They only respond to math. Debt that cannot be repaid will be restructured. Currency that cannot be trusted will be replaced. Systems that cannot sustain themselves will be erased and rebuilt under new rules. The question isn't whether the sequence completes. The question is how prepared you are for the stage most people don't realize they were already approaching.